What's going on today, everyone? Today, I want to talk about the Sony A1 Mark II that Sony just announced last week. We're a little bit behind here on this video, but I felt like this was a huge announcement and a big-time camera that's coming out for Sony. And so I wanted to talk about it a little, and we're going to react actually to Gerald Undone's review of this camera because I think he did a really nice job, and I have a little bit of commentary I want to touch on in regards to this camera. But as you can see, we're talking next level with this camera. This is a new flagship mirrorless camera for Sony. It is coming in at a very high price tag of $6,500. However, the features speak for themselves. 50 megapixel full frame. When it comes to video, you get 8K 30 frames, 4K 120p at 10 bits. So the video capabilities are huge on this camera. You, of course, have 8.5 stop IBIS and dynamic stabilization and so much more. But rather than me sitting here kind of jumping through the specs, let's look at Gerald Undone's video. We'll talk about it a little bit and kind of discuss whether this camera might be right for you. So let's jump in and we'll get a go on this. We'll just kind of skip through the video and talk about a few different bits that he has to say about this camera.
This is my review of the Sony A1 Mark II. Although to be fair, it's probably going to be a little bit more of a rant. Because if you know anything about me or this channel, you know this is probably should be a very exciting launch for me. I have been a huge fan of the original A1 since it came out. I at one point switched all my cameras to A1s. I still use it for all my lens tests. I've compared it favorably against cinema cameras. I talk about the A1 a lot. I love it. I think it's a fantastic camera. But just because I don't think this is as exciting of a launch as it could be or should be for me, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with this camera. In fact, the A1 Mark II is definitely Sony's best camera. It's damn near perfect. And so on that note, when it comes to hybrid cameras, it's probably personally my favorite camera of all time, the A1 Mark II. But because of the A1 and because of the way Sony releases cameras and the cameras that come afterwards and the way they trickle software and
now, just to preempt this, the A1, the original, came out about 4+ years ago now. So this is time for an upgrade, but curious to see what he has to say here about why he's not necessarily psyched about this release.
Other ones and how they treat firmware updates and the firmware updates that were for the A1. Because of all this, it's hard for me just to look at the A1 Mark II just as a camera in a vacuum and say how good it is. I would like to take you on a journey of my swirling mind about how I feel about this launch. But before that, I should provide some disclosure. Sony did lend me this camera to make this review. I don't get to keep it. No money changed hands.
So let's jump in here and we'll look at what he has to say about the sensor. Now, let's jump in
the sensor.
First.
It is the same sensor as the original A1. So same resolution. I tested the dynamic range. I busted out the Xyla 21. Same results for dynamic range. I tested the rolling shutter. Same results for rolling shutter. Now, there are some other components that have been added into this camera. For instance, it has the...
So the question will be, if you're jumping into this video and you own the Mark I, is it worth upgrading? That's something that we'll see here. If you don't have an A1, is it worth jumping into the Mark II, or do you take the Mark I at a cheaper price? Again, something we'll see, but we do know now that they do have the same sensor. So the camera sensor, resolution-wise, not taking a step forward. We're at the same level.
The AI processing chip. So I have no problem with this camera now having the more advanced subject detection. And it even has the auto mode, the auto switching mode, which is great. So you don't just have to go in and switch it to people, then go in and switch it to animals. You can just put on auto, and it is very good at detecting that's a cat.
Again, that's a big change here, is that they now have AI capabilities. So the AI chip's going to make autofocus so much better in this Mark II. That's what I've heard from a lot of reviewers so far, is that the autofocus is going to be a whole heck of a lot better.
The AI processing in it, it's great. And it makes this camera autofocus much better than the A1. So that's good. Also, it has a new IBIS module, which again is hardware. So the module is better and improved. And apparently it's rated for 8.5 stops instead of the 5.5 on the Mark I. And I have some test footage here to share with you where, you know, in walking tests, in standard, I didn't notice a huge difference between the A1 Mark II and the A1 despite it having 3 more stops. But when we get to active, it definitely seems to have an improvement, especially you can see in the walking quickly and then in the jogging after in the tracking shot. The active on the Mark II is significantly better in video than the Mark I.
That's pretty good.
So in video, you know, that is an improvement. If you're just doing minor stabilization,
I still think with video, a lot of people are using gimbals anyway, so it may not be that critical. I don't know that it's worth making the jump to the Mark II just for the IBIS situation. Let's jump over. We will actually want to look at the new features. I don't want to take this whole video and jump through. I want to look at a couple key points, one being the new features on the A1 Mark II.
Those smaller features. And some of these are more contentious because they're like, could they not have just been added in firmware? First of all, pre-capture. This camera now offers pre-capture up to 1 second, meaning that you can set it so that even if you were a second late on pressing the shutter button, you can still get those photos from up to a second before. So that's sweet.
So let's talk about pre-capture real quick. Pre-capture means that the camera is effectively recording up to a second prior to you actually pressing the trigger button. So if you're a sports photographer, which this camera is fantastic for, if you miss a moment and you're off by a second on pressing that trigger, you can actually still capture that frame because you're pre-capturing by up to a second here. So this is a really, really helpful tool when you're in critical moments like wedding photography or sports photography, things that are happening in real time that you need to be ready for the key moment. I think this is a fantastic upgrade on this camera, the pre-capture.
Now, when I talk about these features, by the way, I'm comparing it to the Alpha 1, assuming that you have the latest firmware on the Alpha 1, meaning the one that had brought focus breathing compensation and the 4K 30 webcam and stuff like that. These are the features that are still in addition to the latest firmware that you will find on the Alpha 1 Mark II. Speed boost, which was, I think we first saw that on the A9 Mark III. So you can set it to this function button on the front, but basically you could be shooting at 1 frame rate, maybe 10 frames a second, and then you could set speed boost to go all the way up to that 30 frames a second. It's not as significant as it is on the A9 III, where that speed boost can be set to go all the way up to like 120 frames per second, but it's still cool to have it if you want just sort of a quick little burst without shooting so many frames the rest of the time.
Right. Basically, the speed boost gives you an option to hold a button. You can then have burst settings on your camera so that you don't always have it on. You're not taking thousands of extra pictures. If for example, there's a quick moment where you want to get that burst shot, you can toggle the speed boost, you get your burst, and then it turns off again when you're back to shooting regularly. So you don't have to shoot 1,000 frames over and over and over.
And then like we already
nice
talked
option,
about, auto framing, framing stabilizer, dynamic active, soft skin, all the vloggy features, if you want to call them that, they're all included here. They're not on the Alpha 1. Maybe they require that extra hardware like we talked about. User LUTs, however, is on here and is not on that camera, and definitely don't require special hardware to get user LUTs. There's no excuse why we didn't get user LUTs in the firmware update over there. There's a new function similar with that, multi-shot pixel image consolidation thing. They're calling it NR shooting, which is basically you can shoot 4 to 32 raw images and then consolidate them using Imaging Edge to basically remove the noise from your photo. It's going to like noise average using the different images and then like lower the noise dramatically.
There's a use case for that.
That's called NR shooting, and that's available on here. There's a bulb timer that's been added to this camera if that's something that's useful to you, as well as full-time DMF. There are more refined autofocus settings in this, especially when it comes to speed change and stuff like that. There's some better autofocus, more refined controls, which is nice. Focus bracketing. When I was doing the review of those macro lenses recently, I didn't realize that my Alpha 1 didn't have focus bracketing, and I had to switch to a cheaper, newer Sony camera just to test the focus bracketing. And I was like, how does it not have that? This one has the focus bracketing, of course it does, and this one still doesn't have it.
Yep.
Log shooting mode for video, which is that whole interface where instead of setting your picture profile to log, it's like in image quality, you just turn on log shooting mode. It still has an issue with it though, even all the way up to this camera, and it's still not in the original Alpha 1, but that's in here now.
The good news with that is that they are focusing more and more on video users, which I think is really great. People love the Sony cameras for video, and thus to finally have a set menu for this raw log shooting is a step in the right direction, I would say.
They also have the 1/48th of a second shutter that they started releasing recently. So
that is also
if you're shooting at 24p, you can set your shutter speed to exactly 1/48.
So many times these mirrorless, small kind of from DSLR to mirrorless cameras, you'd always have to shoot a shutter of 1/50 to get as close as possible to the double frame rate rule for shutter speed. You can never get that 1/48, and finally they do have that, which is really nice.
And that could have been added with firmware to the original Alpha 1. It's also going to be $6,500 US, the same price that the original Alpha 1 was, but I assume the Alpha 1 price is going to go down when this one came out. And it's possible this one could be $100 to $200 less than that $6,500, but it'll be somewhere in that ballpark.
So definitely, again, a high price point. It's going to depend what features you want. It's going to depend what camera you currently have and how you want to upgrade. A high price point, but you are getting something nice out of this.
And so the big question of this video is going to be, how much is everything I just said worth in a dollar amount if you're an existing Alpha 1 user? If you don't have an Alpha 1, say maybe you're an A7 IV user and you were thinking about something like the Alpha 1, but there were some things that were missing and you weren't sure if you wanted to commit to the money. Well, now here you go. Get the Alpha 1 Mark II. It's got everything. It's, like I said, everything Sony's ever come up with, it's in here and it does it well. And for things that it didn't change, like the video performance, it didn't need to, because the video performance in the Alpha 1 is probably still like Sony's best, you know? And a lot of the photography related stuff is still Sony's best. When I said the dynamic range is the same earlier on, this is still one of Sony's best video dynamic range cameras 3 years later. So
I almost think that you're going to be getting more value by the reduced price on the Mark I than you might by making this jump to the Mark II. That's just me saying this. I could be totally off on that analysis, but I do think if they're going to cut the price on the Mark I by a decent amount, like $1,000 or more dollars, you're getting a really great value on that as far as getting started. Now, if you already have the Mark I, it's up to you whether you want to upgrade. But if you don't and you have a much lower camera and you're trying to upgrade, it is worth considering just going for that reduced price on the Mark I, but we don't know how that price reduction will go.
So they didn't really need to improve it. It's still their number one, right? So you're still getting all that, but now you're getting all the features from every line, from the ZV line, from the R line, from the A9 line, from like everything is in here. So it's a no-brainer. It's going to be the same price. Just buy this. It gets more complicated once you see the used market for these, once this comes out, and then that's when you have to ask the question of, how much more money better is this camera? And that is really tricky. I can tell you some things from a user's perspective who's been using the Alpha 1 for a long time of how much value I feel like this new camera would add to me. But take this with a grain of salt. The new screen, I would pay, like if I could just somehow, if I could send this camera into Sony and get this screen added to that, how much would I pay for that? I would pay quite a bit.
That is something about Sony cameras, is they've stepped up a lot on their LCD screen on the back of their cameras in recent years, so that's a huge value. For example, I use the A7 III for most of my shooting. The screen on the back of that is just horrendous. It's almost not even worthwhile. Sometimes I'll shoot something thinking, this came out horribly, and then I bring it onto my computer, I look, and it looks great. There's just not a dynamic range on the screen. It looks really bad. So the upgrade in these screens over time is significant. If that's something you care about, then it's worth the upgrade.
Like up to $1,000, honestly. Like that's how much better. Once you've used one of these new, 10-way flippy screens, I would say up to $1,000. Add in the other things, the subject detection AI processing chip, the better ergonomics and stuff. If you told me that you would want to spend $1,500, $2,000 more, I wouldn't argue with you. I'd say that seems reasonable. $4,000 more seems like a stretch to kind of set a perspective there. So let's say you have an Alpha 1 and you can sell it on the used market for $4,000, $4,500, and then you're going to take that money and buy an Alpha 1 Mark II. I think you did okay. If you can only get $3,000 for that thing and you got to spend another $35,000 over here, I don't know that you're going to appreciate $3,500 improvement. I really don't. And obviously this is going to be completely subjective to you. But if you can turn in your Alpha 1 plus $1,500 and get an Alpha 1 Mark II, I think that was a good deal.
And also, if you don't have an Alpha 1 and you can get one on the used market for $3,000, I think that's a deal and a half. I think that's the move you should be going for. So something to consider based on what camera you currently have. Now let's jump in and just see his final thoughts here before we close out.
Good. Was that the question of this video? Yes.
We'll jump back just a touch.
Is the Alpha 1 Mark II any good? Was that the question of this video? Yes, it's better. It's the Sony's best camera. It's as far as Sony cameras go, as far as everything I've come to know about what makes a Sony camera, this thing's damn near perfect. So good job in that regard. Let's just keep it perfect by keeping it up to date without bricking other features if we can.
So the analysis is this. Fantastic camera here with the A1 Mark II. When does it become worth buying? That's the question. I think if you have something less than an A1 tier and you want to step into that tier of camera with the high quality sensor and everything that comes with it, high quality photos and video, then maybe look at the used market for the Mark I. I think we will be seeing some fantastic deals there. If you have a Mark I or you're already in the high quality market and you want to sell it to then buy this, well, as Gerald's saying, depending what you can get for that sell price, it may be worth the upgrade if the features that you're gaining here are worth it. But again, I just wanted to react to this video, touch on this camera because it is a new release and I haven't talked about it on the channel yet. I think this camera will be Sony's top dog for quite a while now, probably the next 4+ years, but excited to see what else they come out with in the mirrorless line. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like. Let me know in the comments what you think about the A1 Mark II. Is it worth the upgrade? Is it worth buying? Or should someone, if they're looking for a camera in this field, just go with the Mark I? Curious to hear your thoughts below. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll check you back in the next one. Thanks, guys.